I don't care who you are. You're not going anywhere, Richard Harper growled, his voice cold and commanding. But as the storm raged outside, the billionaire CEO found himself in a situation where money and power meant nothing. A group of gangsters was closing in on him, and all his influence couldn't save him. Richard staggered through the restaurant, panic rising in his chest, desperately trying to escape. But his only hope lay in the hands of someone he had never noticed before, Amara Johnson, the black waitress. Amara wasn't supposed to be the hero of this story. She was just a waitress, another invisible figure serving the wealthy in silence. But in this moment, her actions would change everything. As Richard collapsed in the back of the restaurant, blood trickling from his head, Amara's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, she rushed to his side. She didn't scream, she didn't panic. She just worked. "You're going to be okay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. The storm outside howled, the lightning cracking through the sky, but Amara's focus never wavered. She checked his pulse, made sure he was breathing, and dragged him to safety in the kitchen, away from the danger outside. The restaurant was silent except for the storm and Amara's steady breathing as she carefully attended to Richard. His pulse was weak, his body cold, but he was alive. As she worked, she couldn't help but think back to her own struggles. She'd been overlooked, judged, and dismissed countless times. But none of that mattered now. Richard Harper, the billionaire CEO, needed her. The irony wasn't lost on her. He was the same man who once looked right through her, treating her like she was invisible. And now, his life was in her hands. "Please," Richard whispered, barely conscious. "Don't let them find me." His words were barely audible, but they struck a chord with Amara. She knew what it felt like to be left behind, to be forgotten. She wasn't going to let him die alone. Not on her watch. The seconds felt like hours, but Amara stayed calm, focused. She knew she had to get him out of there, away from the danger. As Richard's breathing steadied, she found a hidden room in the back of the kitchen, locking the door behind her. There, she waited, her mind racing. Could she really save him? The answer didn't matter. She had made a decision. She would save him. There was no turning back now. As the rain continued to pour outside, Amara sat beside Richard, her back pressed against the cold kitchen wall. His breathing was steady now, the worst of the storm inside and out seeming to pass. She glanced at him, his face pale, his designer suit ruined. But there was something more beneath it all. A man who had once looked through her now lay helpless before her, his life hanging in the balance. The room felt heavy, the silence almost suffocating, but Amara kept her composure. This wasn't the time to think about how unfair life had been to her, about how she had always been the one to sacrifice. Right now, she was focused only on him, on keeping him alive. Richard slowly opened his eyes, the fog of pain still clouding his vision. He blinked several times, trying to focus on the face in front of him. "Where am I?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice low and fragile. Amara didn't flinch. She gave him a calm, reassuring smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You're safe now," she replied quietly. Richard's mind struggled to process the situation. A billion-dollar deal, a high-stakes meeting, gangsters closing in, and now, he was here, with a woman who was supposed to be invisible, someone who had never mattered to him. He let out a soft groan as he tried to sit up, but his body protested, a sharp pain shooting through him. "No, no, stay still," Amara urged gently, her hands pressing him back against the floor. "You're still weak. Let me help." Richard looked up at her, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. She had saved him. A woman he had never noticed, never cared to notice, had dragged him to safety and kept him alive. He had taken her presence for granted before, dismissing her as nothing more than another person in the background of his world of wealth and power. But now, as he looked at her, he saw her for who she really was. "I owe you my life," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Amara didn't respond immediately. She just nodded, her eyes downcast, focusing on the task at hand. She wasn't here for gratitude. She was here because he needed her. That was all that mattered. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, processing the turn his night had taken. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small kitchen, it was strangely calm. His thoughts drifted to everything that had led him here, to the arrogant decisions, the misplaced confidence, and the people he had disregarded along the way. For the first time in his life, Richard Harper felt small. He wasn't in control anymore. And it was the woman who he had once dismissed as invisible who had shown him what true strength was. Amara continued to tend to him, checking his wounds, making sure he was comfortable. She didn't need his thanks, didn't need his recognition. But the way he was looking at her now, seeing her for the first time, was enough. It was enough to remind her that sometimes the quietest voices carried the most weight. And as the minutes ticked by, the world outside seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. As the rain started to lighten, Amara sat on the worn-out chair in the corner of the small room, watching Richard. He was trying to sit up, his movements still slow and painful. The storm had finally passed, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Richard was no longer the confident billionaire CEO he had been just hours ago. Now, he was a man humbled, vulnerable, and grateful for the woman who had saved his life. "How did you know what to do?" Richard asked, his voice rough from his earlier struggles. Amara looked at him, her expression calm, though inside, her heart was still racing. "I didn't know what to do," she replied softly. "I just did what I had to." There was a long pause as Richard processed her words. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals was now looking at her in a way that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time. "I've spent my whole life thinking I had control," Richard said, his voice heavy with realization. "But tonight, you showed me that control doesn't matter when you have nothing left. When your life depends on someone else, someone who doesn't owe you anything, that's when you realize how fragile everything really is." Amara didn't say anything. She simply nodded, her mind drifting to her own experiences. She had always been the one to fight for what she wanted, to work harder than anyone else, to prove her worth. But even then, she had never felt truly valued. Not by the people around her, not by society. But now, with Richard looking at her, she felt something shift. For the first time, she felt like what she had done mattered. "Thank you," Richard whispered, "for saving my life." Amara's eyes softened. "You don't need to thank me," she said quietly. "I did what anyone would do." But inside, she knew it was more than that. She hadn't just saved him from the physical danger that night. She had given him a glimpse into a world where people weren't defined by their wealth or their status, but by their humanity. The hours seemed to stretch on in that small room, with Richard slowly regaining his strength under Amara's watchful eye. She wasn't a hero, not in the way people often think. But to Richard, she was the person who had given him back his life, who had made him realize that the world wasn't just about power. It was about people. As the night wore on, Amara knew that things would never be the same. She had never asked for anything, never expected recognition, but something in Richard had shifted. And as he looked at her now, with gratitude in his eyes, Amara realized that sometimes the greatest power comes not from what you own, but from what you choose to give. The storm had passed, but it had left something more lasting behind. A connection between two people who had once been worlds apart. The following morning, the city of New Orleans woke to a world washed clean by the rain. But inside the small, dimly lit room, everything was still uncertain. Richard's head was clearer now, and with each passing minute, his body regained more of its strength. He sat up slowly, testing his limbs, making sure the pain was bearable. Amara was by his side, her calm presence as steady as ever. She had brought him water, made sure he ate a small meal, and even offered him a blanket for warmth. But she never asked for anything in return. It wasn't her style. Richard glanced over at her, a mix of gratitude and confusion in his eyes. "You could be anywhere right now," he said softly, his voice still a little hoarse from the previous night's ordeal. "But you're here, helping me." Amara didn't respond right away. She just stared ahead, her mind somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. She had learned long ago that people like her, those who worked in the background, were often forgotten. She didn't mind. She had accepted it. But now, the world she had always known felt strangely different. "I've always been here," she replied finally, her voice steady. But there was a quiet strength in it. Just no one's ever noticed. Richard felt a pang of guilt. He had never seen her, not truly. It was so easy for him to overlook someone like her, someone who had never crossed the boundaries of his world, someone who had never been more than a face in the crowd. But now he saw her, really saw her, and it made him uneasy, as if he were waking up to a truth he had long avoided. He swallowed, looking for the right words. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done," he said quietly. "You didn't have to save me." Amara met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to soften. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Her words hung in the air, as simple as they were profound. For Richard, they resonated in a way he couldn't quite explain. Everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build, seemed insignificant in the face of what had just happened. It wasn't the deal, the power, or the money that mattered anymore. It was the person sitting in front of him, the woman who had saved his life without asking for anything in return. A moment of silence passed between them before Richard finally spoke again. "I think I owe you more than just gratitude," he said. Amara smiled faintly, her eyes still on him, but her expression was unreadable. "You don't owe me anything," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "Just remember that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who end up making the biggest difference." Richard sat back, absorbing her words. It was hard to fathom how much had changed in such a short time. The man who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a background figure was now humbled by her actions. She had shown him something he had never understood before: the power of kindness, the strength that came from choosing to do what was right, regardless of the odds. He knew then that he couldn't let this moment slip away. It had to mean something. "I won't forget this," Richard said, his voice firm with resolve. Amara stood up, ready to leave the room. "You don't have to, but I think it's time for you to go back to your world now," she said. "You have work to do." And with that, she left the room, leaving Richard to reflect on what had just transpired. The city outside continued to bustle, unaware of the quiet transformation that had taken place in one small room, between two people who had once been worlds apart. The days passed, and the world outside continued its relentless pace. Richard returned to his office, his empire of tech and business waiting for him. But everything had changed. The man who once ruled with an iron fist now found himself questioning every decision he had ever made. He sat at his desk, surrounded by the comforts of success, luxury, power, wealth, but something was missing. Amara's words, her actions, echoed in his mind. Sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who end up making the biggest difference. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been blind to the world around him, focused only on the numbers, the profits, and the deals. He had been so focused on himself that he had failed to see the people who made it all possible. He thought about Amara again, how she had saved his life without hesitation, without any expectation of reward, how she had simply done what needed to be done. It struck him then, more powerfully than ever before, that there was more to life than business deals and quarterly reports. It was about the people, the ones who truly mattered. He found himself driving back to the restaurant, unable to shake the feeling that he had unfinished business. He had to make it right. He had to show her that she was more than just a background figure in his world. He arrived at the restaurant, the same one where it had all begun. Amara was there, just as she always was, serving the customers with a quiet dignity that made her stand out, even in the crowd. Richard approached her slowly, not sure how to start. He had never been good with words, especially when it came to matters of the heart. "Amara," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. She looked up, her expression unreadable. I need to talk to you." She nodded, motioning for him to sit down at one of the empty tables. "What's on your mind, Richard?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a trace of caution in it. He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. This was not a business meeting. This was something entirely different. "I wanted to apologize," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "For everything. For not seeing you. For not understanding the importance of what you do. You saved my life, Amara. And I'll never forget that." There was a long silence as Amara absorbed his words. She looked at him carefully, her expression softening just slightly. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Richard nodded, understanding that. "I know, but I want you to know that it meant something. You meant something. And I've spent the past few days thinking about it. About what really matters in life. And I want to make it right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, placing it gently on the table in front of her. "I want to offer you a chance to work with me. To work with Harper Tech. Not as a waitress, but as someone who deserves to be seen for who she truly is." Amara stared at the card, the offer hanging in the air between them. She had never expected this. She had never asked for anything in return, yet here was Richard Harper, offering her something far greater than she could have imagined. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I see you now. And I think the world should, too." For the first time, Amara allowed herself to smile. Not a smile for the customers, not a smile to hide her fatigue, but a smile that was just for her. A smile that said, maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. She took the card, looking at it for a moment before looking up at Richard. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. Richard nodded, knowing that it was all he could ask for. The moment between them wasn't about business anymore. It was about recognition, about seeing each other for who they truly were. And in that moment, Richard understood that the greatest reward wasn't a deal or a contract. It was the understanding that sometimes the people you least expect can change your life forever. The days following their conversation were filled with a quiet tension. Richard found himself increasingly distracted, his mind constantly returning to Amara, to her words, and to the promise he had made to himself. The powerful CEO who once believed that the world revolved around money and influence now found himself questioning everything he had built. As for Amara, she continued with her life, her days flowing as they always had, though there was a subtle shift in her heart. Richard's offer lingered in her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too much too soon. She had never asked for anything, and suddenly, the world seemed to be offering her more than she could grasp. She didn't want to get lost in a world that might never see her as more than just someone to fill a position. But something in Richard's eyes, the sincerity, the change she had seen in him, made her hesitate. One evening, after finishing her shift at the restaurant, Amara sat down on the small balcony of her apartment, staring out at the quiet city. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the air was cool with the approaching night. She could hear the faint hum of traffic in the distance, but for the most part, the world felt still. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find a message from Richard. "I know you're probably busy, but I wanted to check in. I'm here if you want to talk, no pressure." It was simple, thoughtful, and, for some reason, it made Amara smile. She stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that something had changed between them. Amara typed a quick response. "Thanks, Richard. I'll think about it." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next day, Amara made her decision. She walked into the restaurant early, just as the sun was rising, and found Richard sitting at the bar, as though waiting for her. He stood when he saw her, his expression open, a little anxious, but hopeful. "I've thought about your offer," Amara said, her voice steady but softer than usual. "And I'm ready to take the next step." Richard's face lit up with a mixture of relief and excitement. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, I'm sure. But I want to do things my way, in my own time." Richard smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Of course, Amara. I wouldn't want it any other way." From that moment on, things between them changed. Amara started working closely with Richard, not as a waitress, but as someone who had her own voice, her own ideas, and her own place in the world. Richard never treated her as less than. He saw her, truly saw her, and he made sure she knew it every single day. As they spent more time together, the walls that had once separated them began to crumble. It wasn't always easy, but it was real. They worked together, learned from each other, and slowly, over time, built something more than just a business partnership. Amara had found her place, not because Richard had offered it to her, but because she had earned it in her own way, through her actions, her heart, and her unwavering belief that kindness and strength could coexist in this world. And in return, Richard found something he had never expected, someone who made him feel truly alive, not because of his power or his wealth, but because of the person he was becoming with her by his side. Months passed, and Amara found herself more immersed in the world that had once seemed so distant. Richard kept his word. He never treated her like anything less than an equal. They worked together, side by side, learning and growing. As they spent more time together, their professional relationship deepened into something more. They began to trust each other in ways that went beyond business, and the respect they had for one another grew stronger with every passing day. Richard watched Amara with a quiet admiration. She wasn't just a waitress-turned-employee, she was a force. Her ideas were sharp, and her perspectives were refreshing. She brought a new energy to Harper Tech that it had never seen before. But what struck him the most was how effortlessly she made everyone around her better. Richard had built an empire on his own, but Amara was teaching him a new kind of leadership, one rooted in empathy, understanding, and genuine connection. There were moments when he would catch himself thinking back to the night she saved his life, the night everything changed. It wasn't just the physical danger that had shaken him. It was the realization that he had been blind to the world, only seeing what was in front of him and never looking deeper. Amara had shown him the importance of people, of real connections, and how those connections could change the course of everything. One afternoon, as they sat in his office discussing a new project, Richard looked at Amara, his mind momentarily lost in thought. "You've changed everything for me, Amara," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I haven't done anything extraordinary," she replied with a small smile. "I'm just doing what I believe is right." Richard smiled, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that showed how much he had come to rely on her. "That's what makes it extraordinary," he said. The project they were working on was a breakthrough for Harper Tech, something that would set the company apart from the competition. As they brainstormed and developed ideas, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of pride not only in the success of the project, but in the partnership they had built. For the first time in his life, he realized that true success wasn't measured by the size of his company or the deals he closed. It was measured by the people who were with him along the way, the people who believed in something more than just profit. As they wrapped up the meeting, Richard stood and walked over to the window, his gaze fixed on the city below. Amara followed, standing beside him as they both looked out over the skyline. "Do you ever wonder how things might have turned out if we hadn't met?" he asked quietly. Amara took a deep breath, considering his question. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice thoughtful. "But I believe everything happens for a reason, and I'm glad we found each other." Richard nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had never believed in fate, but there was something about this moment, something about the way their paths had crossed that night, that made him think maybe she was right. In the quiet that followed, they stood there together, not as a CEO and an employee, but as two people who had found something real in a world that often overlooked it. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Richard knew that this was what truly mattered. Months passed, and with each day, Richard and Amara's partnership grew stronger. The projects they worked on together began to gain traction, and Harper Tech's reputation in the industry started to shift. Richard could feel the difference in the way people looked at him now, the way his decisions were influenced not just by numbers, but by a deeper understanding of the people around him. He wasn't the same man he had been when he first met Amara. He had learned to listen more, to value the perspectives of others, and most importantly, to see people for who they truly were. One evening, as they sat in the conference room discussing the latest development in a major project, Richard looked across the table at Amara. Her focus was sharp, her insights invaluable, and he felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with his wealth or status. "You've really changed everything, you know that?" Richard said, breaking the silence. Amara looked up at him, her expression calm, but there was a hint of something in her eyes, something that made Richard feel as though she had already known this was coming. "I think we've both changed," she replied with a small smile. "You more than me." Richard laughed softly, shaking his head. "Maybe," he said, "but I think you had a bigger impact than you realize. You've taught me more about leadership, about people, than I could have ever learned on my own." Amara paused for a moment, as though weighing his words carefully. "Leadership isn't just about making the right decisions," she said slowly. "It's about understanding why those decisions matter. It's about seeing people as more than just resources, but as individuals with their own stories." Richard nodded, impressed by her insight. It was a lesson he had learned the hard way, but one he knew he would never forget. As the evening wore on and the meeting came to a close, Richard stood up, feeling a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just the success of their projects. It was the fact that he had found something much more valuable. He had found respect, connection, and a partnership that went beyond work. "I have a dinner planned for tonight," Richard said, his voice suddenly quieter. "I know it's short notice, but I'd like you to join me." Amara looked at him, surprised by the invitation. She had been expecting a typical business meeting, but this felt different. "Dinner?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just the two of us." Richard nodded, a genuine smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just the two of us. I'd like to thank you, properly, for everything you've done. Not just for Harper Tech, but for me. You've helped me see the world differently, Amara." Amara considered his words for a moment, then nodded. "I'd like that," she said simply. That evening, they went to a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of the city, a place where neither of them had ever been before. The atmosphere was intimate, the kind of place where real conversations could happen. As they sat across from each other, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on their faces, Richard found himself feeling more vulnerable than he had ever been in his life. For the first time, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't wearing the mask of a CEO or the armor of wealth. He was just a man, sitting across from someone who had changed his life. "You know," Richard began, his voice soft but steady, "when I first met you, I had no idea what you were capable of. I saw you as just another employee, just another face in the crowd." Amara looked up at him, her eyes calm but filled with understanding. "And now?" she asked, her voice gentle. Richard took a deep breath, his gaze meeting hers. "Now, I see you as someone who changed everything for me," he said quietly. "You taught me to see people, to value them, to listen. You taught me that success isn't just about numbers, it's about the people you meet along the way." Amara smiled, a soft, genuine smile. "It's funny," she said, "how the people who least expect to make a difference are the ones who end up changing the most lives." Richard smiled back, his heart full. "Maybe," he said, "but I think you're the one who changed mine." As weeks went by, Amara's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. Harper Tech's newest projects were taking off, and she found herself at the center of it all. No longer just the quiet waitress, she was now a key player in the company, her ideas influencing every decision. It was a world she had never dreamed of being a part of, yet here she was, helping shape the future of a tech giant. But with the new position came new challenges. The pressure to perform, the weight of expectations, and the constant balancing act between staying true to herself and fitting into a world that was so different from her past. Richard was there, always by her side, offering his support and guidance. It wasn't always easy, but they made it work, finding a rhythm that blended their strengths. Richard admired Amara's determination and intelligence more than ever, but he also saw the toll it was taking on her. One evening, after a particularly long day, Richard found her in the office, staring at her computer screen, lost in thought. "You need to rest," he said gently, standing in the doorway. Amara looked up, surprised to see him. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tired but determined. "I just need to finish this." Richard shook his head. "No, you don't," he said, walking toward her. "You've given everything to this company. You've earned the right to take a break." Amara hesitated for a moment before finally nodding. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "I guess I've been so focused on proving myself that I forgot to take care of myself." Richard smiled softly, sitting down across from her. "It's easy to get lost in all of this," he said, his voice understanding. "But remember, you're not alone anymore. We're in this together." Amara looked at him, a sense of relief washing over her. For the first time in a long while, she realized that she didn't have to do everything on her own. With Richard by her side, she could face whatever came next. The next few months were a whirlwind of success, but also of balance. Amara learned to take breaks when needed, to lean on the team she had built around her, and to recognize that her worth wasn't just tied to her work. It was in the relationships she built, the way she helped others, and the kindness she extended to herself. Richard, too, grew alongside her. He learned the value of slowing down, of appreciating the small moments that made life worth living. And as they continued to build Harper Tech into something truly extraordinary, they did it together, as equals, as partners. Their bond grew deeper, not just through work, but through their shared experiences and the trust they had built. They had both come a long way from where they had started, and in each other, they had found something priceless, a partnership based on respect, understanding, and the belief that, together, they could face anything. And as they stood on the balcony of Richard's office, looking out at the city below, Amara knew that this was just the beginning. The future was uncertain, But with Richard by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. They had proven to themselves that anything was possible as long as they had each other.